Good evening. Welcome to our March 11th, 2025 edition of Week to Week, the Political Roundtable from Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California. If you have a smartphone or a dumb phone, anything that makes a lot of phone noise, please silence it or turn it off, because we, of course, are streaming live and we're recording this. I'm John Zipper, your host for Week to Week, as well as the Commonwealth Club's Vice President of Media and Editorial. Now, besides the political stuff we're going to hopefully give you some good insight on tonight, we also report very useful news you can use. So, if you want to write this down, the countries that used to be our friends but are now our enemies are the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Ukraine, Mexico, really all of the EU and NATO, including France, of course, but they were always kind of iffy. Countries that used to be our enemies but are now our best buddies, Russia. That's pretty much it. So, anyway, that's just, put it on a card in your wallet or something. Now for some real insight, let's meet our panelists for tonight. I'll start at the other end of the stage with Tim Anaya. He's the Vice President of Marketing and Communications at the Pacific Research Institute, and he's the co-author of the California Left Coast Survivor's Guide. Welcome back, Tim. In the center seat is Guy Marzorati. He's the correspondent for the California Politics and Government desk at KQED Radio. Welcome back. Now tonight, I want to start talking about state and local stuff rather than going right to the national. And let's start talking about Governor Gavin Newsom, the man, the myth, the podcast. In fact, he recently launched his own podcast because, of course, what millennial doesn't have his own podcast? And in the first episode, he talked with the right-wing activist Charlie Kirk. In that conversation, Captain Kirk, we'll call him, their topics included transgender athletes, and Governor Newsom said it was unfair for transgender athletes to participate in girls' sports. That set off a firestorm of criticism from progressives. Tim, what do you think of this controversy? And I guess my real question is, was this Newsom accidentally kind of stumbling into a mistake, or did he want to get this out that he had this position?
Well, I find the whole podcast very interesting, and in thinking about it and writing about it, I have kind of a listener's guide for you, and it's good for people in California, but also people across the country who are the intended audience of this. So as I write about in my book, really what you should be looking to is judge Gavin Newsom by what he actually does, not what he says. And so Gavin Newsom, right, he's the king of, I want to set a vibe, I want to create the feels. And so on this issue, right, it was not an accident that he did this. And if you look at the setup of the whole show, right, so has the show, he has a kind of a political provocateur as his guest, and says this kind of, very provocative line there. But look what happened afterward, right? You have Senator Weiner says, how can you be on this show with that vile bigot? You have Charlie Kirk himself comes out and says, well, you got to give him credit. He appears to be moderating. That's someone you should keep an eye on as he's looking to 2028. And Gavin himself now is on the 80 side of an 80-20 issue. Now, if you look at his record, this is a man 2 years ago, when they had the Republican debate in Simi Valley, said, this issue is the biggest distraction of them all when we have all these other issues to debate. So I think all of this really, I put it in the context of he is setting the table for the 2028 campaign. And I think one of the interesting things about it, and you're going to see this on other issues as this podcast goes on, is whatever your issue is, Gavin Newsom has 2 or 3 bullet points of things that he can tick off. A lot of them are rhetorical, a lot of them are vibes. Some of them are actually things that he's done. So if you're a small business owner in South Carolina, he's got 5 things to tell you that he's done through his career. And if LGBT is your issue, he's got 5 things he can tell you that he's done there. So I think it's really all about that he's setting the table for 2028, and this is the first of many of things like this we're going to see.
Guy?
I think he better hope a 2028 campaign doesn't look like that podcast, though, because that moment with Kirk where he's talking about, there's a unfairness here in transgender athletes participating in female sports, but we have to recognize their humanity. That might have been his best moment of the podcast. The other hour and a half, he was slapped around rhetorically and basically pled the fifth on policy after policy that he had supported as governor and tried to either distance himself, kind of moonwalk away from. He put up no fight, no argument. I think for a lot of people, that's what has endeared them to Gavin Newsom through the years. He's been a Democrat who wants to fight the culture wars, who's not afraid of having those debates with Sean Hannity, with Ron DeSantis. He looked to have completely lost that will to fight in that podcast. And I think if you're a Democrat, think about if you're a Democrat in the state legislature, right? They lost 3 seats in this last election. You come back to Sacramento pledging to focus on affordability. You hear that from the Speaker of the Assembly, from a lot of Democrats. And you see the governor, grab his stopwatch and his whistle and try to adjudicate who's winning the high jump down at the track and field invitational. You got to think, where's the party's priority right now? And most importantly, where's Newsom's priority as it relates to what's actually happening at the Capitol and not, on the campaign trail in 2028? So I think with good reason, there were a lot of Democrats who were really upset with how that all played out.
And I think they have been upset with him, I would say, about a little before 4th of July last year, when Gavin Newsom was trying to get an alternative measure to Prop 36 on the ballot and get Democrats in the legislature to take a very tough vote, go out on a limb to put this on the ballot, and then basically decided, well, I'd rather be across the country on the Biden campaign trail. So let's throw that bill out and I'll see you later. And you could argue he hasn't really been doing much governing since then.
Or, even this January, he day after the election, he calls this special session. We're going to fight Trump. We're going to pass this legislation, set aside money to, bring legal challenges to the administration. Makes a lot of lawmakers in the Assembly and Senate take a tough vote on that. There's a lot more folks in the legislature who represent Trump districts, Democrats representing Trump districts, than there were in 2017. So that was their welcome gift to Sacramento. You show up, we need you to vote on this special session. And then Newsom walks away from the special session, signs the bills late on a Friday evening, which in the media world is when you want to just kind of bury something. So I think, there's got to be at some point a lack of trust between Newsom and I think some of the Democratic leaders in Sacramento. We'll see if his attention turns back to the Capitol or if this is just going to be 2 more years of podcasting.
Well, he is a lame duck as podcaster in chief. Today, we had someone, a big name, throw her hat in the ring to potentially succeed him. That is Katie Porter. Let's start with you, Tim. I know you were just doing some reporting on this. I'm sorry, I pointed at Guy, but I said Tim. Guy, I know you just were doing some reporting on this.
Yeah, I think this would be an interesting wrinkle in. Look, 2026. The big question is Kamala Harris going to get in the governor's race? We probably won't know that for months. The reason these governor campaigns start so early, you had some candidates declare a year ago, is because it just takes a lot of time to raise the money you need to run a statewide campaign in California. It takes a lot of time to get that name ID out there, to grow your familiarity with the electorate. Kamala Harris doesn't have those problems. She could wake up in August, raise all the money she needs to run for governor. She's known across the state. So she's taking her time with her decision. In the meantime, though, we did see Katie Porter jump into that race today. Porter, I think, her Senate run did not go very well last year. She
didn't win?
She didn't win. She didn't even make it out of the primary.
Yeah.
I think you can look at that honestly and say, if you were to run her campaign in a politics simulator, I don't know if we have those, 100 times, she got probably a bottom 5 outcome. She is a politician who is at her best when she's focused on kitchen table issues, when she's talking about the cost of living. I'm sure many of you have seen her grill executives and Trump administration officials. Those were not the issues in the 2024 Senate primary. It was Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, which Porter never found her footing on. That was not an issue she's well suited to. And then it was about Trump's reemergence in the Republican Party, which was a natural fit for Adam Schiff, who had kind of built his name contrasting himself with Trump. So, maybe the dice rolls a different way. There's better luck for Porter this time around, but that, again, could all change if Harris jumps in.
Now, Tim, your take.
Well, I view her a little differently. You know, I think you look at the campaign of 2024, she was a huge hit online. She's a huge hit with the activists. She raised a lot of money online, but really was a flop at the ballot box. I mean, she came in a weak third. It wasn't a close third. It was a weak third. So I think it's, maybe one we need to look at closely of the energy online and the energy in the activist world isn't necessarily the energy of the broader electorate. Now, what's also different in this election, now we've seen the early polls, right? And she's got the name ID of who's running. But look at who you have out there, right? You're going to have no shortage of candidates if the former vice president does not get in. You've got the lieutenant governor, Eleni Kounalakis, who could self-fund the race. You have Antonio Villaraigosa, the former mayor of LA, who has huge name recognition and potentially huge funding base. You have Javier Becerra may run, who's a former secretary of HHS, no slouch in the electoral arena himself. You've got Tony Atkins. Watch Tony Atkins, the former president of the state Senate. That's who I'd keep my eye on this. But then remember, you have the calculus of the election, and it's the top two. If Republicans get their act together and have a candidate that they coalesce behind, that person probably will make the top two. If that's the scenario, a Katie Porter is probably favored. If they don't, if you have a muddled Republican field, really it's anybody's bet. And the question to me is, if you get a general election where it's her versus another Democrat in the general election, I don't know that I would call her the favorite by any means. I think the other person would probably be favored in that environment.
Yeah, that's kind of been the myth of the top two, right? In these statewide elections, there's this thought that, if two Democrats can make it out in a blue state, we will have a Democrat on Democrat general election. But in practice, it's been Republicans consolidate around a candidate. Maybe that's Chad Bianco, the sheriff from Riverside this time around. And then it really is like one ticket out of town in the primary. And so that gives this really outsized focus among the Democrats to who will make it out. I do think on the Harris piece, and tell me what you all think, like we hear from politicians all the time, I'm made for this job, or I have a calling for, God came to me in the middle of the night and said, I need you on the board of equalization. Right. And it's like, so that you hear that, but then we're also hearing all these candidates would drop their campaign on a whim if Harris got in.
Right.
That's the kind of thing where people are like, I can't believe, I can't get into politics. If the same people that are telling me this is their calling, they'll drop it all if this other person gets in the race.
It's a weird dynamic of kind of where Harris has positioned herself, because the kind of tea leaves they've been putting out, right, is that, well, by the summer she's going to make a move. Well, maybe she has the luxury of doing that. Maybe not. Maybe that actually she's complicating things for herself. One thing is clear, not everybody's going to drop out. There's going to be somebody who runs against her and tests the theory. And yes, she's from California. Yes, she has huge advantages. Yes, all that is true. She can raise all the money. What do Democrats feel about her after the last election? Are they as enthusiastic about her to want her as the next governor after the last election? There may be, we don't know yet, there may be some real fatigue or some thoughts of, gee, you had your chance. And look what you got us. You got us another term of President Trump. Do we want to reward you with the governorship after the campaign that you ran? So I think it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be harder for her than people think. But right now, all the polls, it's just name ID. I don't think I would put much stock in them, but you have the potential. Guy wants 8 candidates and fun debates and all of the things to write about. And
more the merrier, yes.
Right. But, we'll see. But I think she has it's a more complicated road to the governorship than you'd think.
So do you not agree then with the people who kind of say she's going to clear the field on the Democratic side, should she jump in?
I think she would clear much of the field, but I think Tim's right in that there's candidates who have, if you're Antonio Villaraigosa, why get out? There's no other office, there's no And you're probably running in a different lane. Villaraigosa has kind of billed himself as more of a centrist Democrat. A lot of these other folks, I think, would pivot to running for a different statewide office. So maybe they'll look at superintendent of public instruction or state treasurer, find that like nice, soft place to land. But I think there certainly could be room for someone like Villaraigosa. And then who knows? Maybe there's self-funded candidates, Rick Caruso, people like that who could jump in this race and kind of shake things up. Because, Tim, to your point, maybe Democrats want to get out of the anointing business.
Yes. Test their mettle as a candidate. But that's the big point, too, is there's, 3 or 4 of the statewide offices I think are going to be open this year. So there's a lot of room for, office shopping. And there are no huge, overwhelming favorites for any of those other offices right now.
Okay. Well, another California politician who has been breaking with party orthodoxy is San Jose Mayor Matt Mahan. Mahan, am I pronouncing that correctly? Guy, again, you recently reported on his effort in the way he's looking at addressing unhoused people who refuse shelter. Can you talk a bit about what his plan is and reaction is?
So Mahan, just to kind of set the table, he really did run as an outsider in 2022 in San Jose, beat Cindy Chavez, who was seen as kind of like the kind of establishment standard bearer, the heavy favorite for that seat. And Mahan has really tried to shake up the ways in which San Jose tries to reduce homelessness with city money. The main way he's tried to do this is to move funding away from building affordable housing, permanent apartments, towards more interim housing, temporary housing, and shelter. So that's a shift that you've now started to see spread to San Francisco. Karen Bass in LA is really taken root across the state, but Mahan's kind of been at the front of this. And then last week, rolling out this policy where he said, if we offer you shelter 3 times and you refuse it, you can be subject to arrest. Now, part of this is like city politics at play. I live down in San Jose, so I follow the council. Mahan has a 6-vote majority. There was a council member resigned because of a scandal. There was an appointment. Mahan has the 6 votes he needs to get his agenda through, so he's going for it all in this budget. He's really packing this up with every one of his priorities. But I do think this is a question for mayors, not just in San Jose, but in San Francisco and Oakland, which is this population so-called service resistant. Once you get to a population of people who are experiencing homelessness who say, I don't want that shelter bed you're offering, or I don't even want that tiny home studio apartment that you're offering, what do you do in that scenario? And I think Mahan's critics would say that you're too far, we're not there yet. In Santa Clara County, the vacancy rate in shelter is like 5%. There's still a lot of people who want shelter and can't get it. But eventually you will get to a population, if you keep building shelter and interim housing, where you're down to the people who don't want it. And then what do you do? And in San Francisco, they've reported 50% of people they encounter on tent sweepings are saying, no, I don't want to go inside. So I think that's a huge question, not just for Mahan, but I think for a lot of these local leaders.
It's an interesting issue that follows out of a big Supreme Court ruling that happened last year, the Grants Pass case, which has followed another ruling called Boise versus Martin. And basically the issue of, if you are a city, what powers do you have to do just this? If you have someone who's a homeless person in a tent encampment in a community and they won't move along, what can you do? And Boise really handcuffed them. And they said, if you don't have essentially a shelter bed for every homeless person in your community, you can't do anything. Grants Pass largely reversed that ruling. So now you're seeing a mayor here saying, let's test out some of these policies. Some mayors still have been reluctant to embrace the new powers that they have. Now, what Mahan's doing and talking about this interim supportive housing, it's very innovative. One of the groups that he's working with, we at PRI had a chance to tour their facility here in San Francisco. It's called Dignity Moves. And their CEO, Elizabeth Funk, came out of the kind of young presidents' organizations, and they approached the issue as, well, how do we do it, and what do we do? And it's fascinating here. You know, they take a plot of land that is going to be built on in 4 or 5 years, and they say, for those 4 years, while you're going through the process, give it to us. They have these beautiful little communities with porches, and they think of everything, right? And they all have the little thing for a forklift. So when you need that plot of land tomorrow, they say, call me, we'll get them out of here in 24 hours. They even have in Santa Barbara a community like this. It's designed in Spanish-style architecture. You'd never know. And so now that you have these, in San Jose, they're working on a big project there with Dignity Moves. So now we have this next question of, if you do not voluntarily move, what can we do? And I think, it's what Gavin Newsom's Care Court issue has been about, and the conservatorship kind of movement, and, can we force you to go into treatment or force you to go into a sobriety program? That probably will need to be litigated. I imagine that part of it where we're at now, I'm sure the mayor will be sued on some of these things. But the broader question of, can he move the 10 encampment along? Yeah. And I think, when we talk earlier about kind of these, where does the public stand, these kind of 80-20, 70-30 issues, we may have the statistics, that's only a 5% vacancy or whatever. I bet you for most of the public that has to go in these areas, 5% is probably too much. So Mahan, right, he's probably on the side of most voters here in the city. He may catch heat from his party's base or when he goes for the next election, but I bet he's probably, on the side of what most of the voters are thinking on this.
And to your point, I think part of it is a reframing of what is shelter, right?
Yeah.
We have this idea of shelter as these, congregate shelters with bunk beds and terrible conditions. There's a Cal Matters investigation recently on just how horrible these places are around the state. These tiny homes, interim housing, I've toured a bunch of them in San Jose, very different. These are basically like studio apartments.
Yeah.
You have privacy, you have your own bathroom. Is that a way to rebrand the idea of shelter that, to your point, might win more public support? Because I think, the public might still have a hard time saying, well, I wouldn't want to spend a night in a huge, massive congregate shelter. But if you're able to showcase, more of these kind of housing, does that change the kind of political calculus that residents make when they weigh this?
And they think of everything, these facilities. Some of them, right, you don't think of, they need space for couples. They have facility for couples, for pets. You can have pets there. I was impressed. There was a gal we met. She's a very creative person. And Elizabeth Funk told us, so I told her, hey, you should design the designs. She made jewelry. Put it on Etsy, and we'll help you put it on Etsy and brand it as a homeless person making jewelry. She made enough money to get herself out of the facility. There was another gal who was an accountant. Bookkeeping was her thing. And she said, we've got business know-how. Let's set you up and get you on the path. She was able to move into a regular apartment of her own. So it's, when you go and see these, they really are doing important work, and they really are turning around people's lives. So that's the trend where we should be going. And the most important thing as a taxpayer, it's significantly cheaper. These, I think she said they cost, the ones here in San Francisco, $30,000 a unit, and they last for 20 years. They're well built. That's significantly less than the per person price. When you're in LA and you're talking about, the permanent housing, some of those units cost $1 million a unit. So it's an innovative and interesting idea that's growing in support. And so this is going to be interesting to watch, to see how the mayor fares on the legal side of things, but also what are the results.
Okay. Before we move off the state and local stuff, I just wanted to check in on the Oakland mayor's race. Barbara Lee, I guess Lauren Taylor. Are there other candidates in the race? Apologize for not knowing.
Yes, there are a few others. I would probably say Lee and Taylor are considered the front runners, certainly the most likely to come out of this ranked choice election. To me, this is an interesting test of in the Bay Area, we've been in this kind of mode, this moment of real kind of throw the bums out energy, right? We've seen that in San Francisco. You had the successive recalls of the school board, the district attorney. That happened in Oakland with the mayor, Oakland, Alameda County with the district attorney. I mentioned Matt Mahan winning a really unexpected victory. To me, I wonder if we're nearing the end of that period in local politics. And I think Barbara Lee winning this race would kind of be a signal in that direction. Because again, you have the dynamic of Barbara Lee running with all the entrenched support, all the local unions backing Barbara Lee. Lauren Taylor, more of this kind of technocratic. He wants to, change up budget practices. He wants to have those tough conversations with the organized labor, which mean people are going to get laid off. I think this could be a test for that, because you are seeing some signals that perhaps the kind of general public's opinion is moving on a lot of these local spaces. San Francisco, there was a poll that came out a couple weeks ago, like right track, wrong track for the city. The last time they took it was in October, and I think it was well underwater, people's feelings about which direction the city was headed in. They took it again in January, and that had completely flipped. One poll from Grow SF, another from the City Chamber of Commerce. And so as you start to see those kind of moods shift among the electorate, I wonder if that's encouraging for Barbara Lee, or if she'll just be the latest victim of this, anti-establishment, kind of anti-incumbent mood in the region.
I would say on that, some of that may be explained by you fired the mayor.
Yeah.
You got a new mayor. So now we like the mayor and things are going well because our guy is the mayor. I think your point is a good one on the Oakland mayor's race, right? Because these are voters that have been incredibly frustrated with crime, with homelessness, with the kind of political corruption there, lack of economic opportunity, so much that they fire the mayor, fire the district attorney. And so it doesn't really make logical sense that why would you then hire the candidate who would actually embrace more of the policies that you as voters have said you don't want? I wonder if it might be her name ID and popularity and all the years of kind of being an activist and all of that is overpowering here. Lauren Taylor is a very interesting candidate. I actually know his brother, Preston. I think it's his twin brother, actually. Interesting, thoughtful guy. He would be, I think he'd get a lot of attention nationally if he were the mayor of Oakland. The other thing, too, that's kind of interesting to watch, right, is the phenomenon, right, of all the controversy with Karen Bass as mayor of Los Angeles and the issues she has had during the wildfires. It's an issue of you're a legislator. And it's very different than to be elected as a mayor and assume an executive role. I think a lot of Karen Bass's challenges is she's been, a legislator for so long. And so you wonder, is that the skill set that you want in the next leader? Someone who really is kind of a city activist from back in the day, if you watch the great movie, which I did not too long ago with Regina King, back from the Shirley Chisholm days, and being a kind of backbench, rabble-rouser member of Congress. So it's going to be interesting to watch, but voters don't always kind of have a logical flow to how they do things.
But I mean, you mentioned that dynamic of the legislator, the kind of hero in Congress coming home. We've seen, I've thought about Ron Dellums in this vein, right? And that was someone that's Barbara Lee's mentor. That's who she worked for. He was this revered Congress member in the East Bay, came back as mayor. And it didn't go as well, right? It was kind of towards the end of his career. Yes, he got hit with the Great Recession, but there was just a lot of criticism that he wasn't totally present, wasn't totally up for that job. And whoever wins that race in Oakland, it's going to be a tough couple of years. Like, you have to take office right away, April, May, start cutting, start firing, start having layoffs, start, trying to piece the budget back together. There just isn't the kind of commercial revenue coming into the city. So yeah, is Barbara Lee up for that job to take office on day one, sit down with all the people who have supported her for years, who supported her campaign, and say, all right, we need to talk layoffs from your groups? That's going to be a really difficult task. On the flip side, I think she's the kind of person who could potentially have the acumen and maybe the support in the community to make some lasting change to the way Oakland's government is structured. Because I actually think that's a big issue regarding the city. Oakland has this very bizarre system of governance that is not like a strong mayor system like San Francisco, where the mayor's overseeing the departments and getting to hire and fire. It's not a weak mayor system like you have in San Jose, where the mayor is just one vote on the council and you actually have like a professional city manager running day-to-day operations. It's this weird hybrid where there is a city manager, a city administrator, but that person is hired and fired by the mayor. And you actually saw this play out in the Sheng Tao scandal, where Tao would say, hire this person. city administrator would say, that, that person is not qualified for the job. I don't know. Go ahead and hire that person. And that's the dynamic that exists. And then you have a city council that doesn't oversee day-to-day operations. The mayor, doesn't actually have veto power over the budget, so they sometimes get rolled by the council. It's a real mess. So it could be Barbara Lee has the kind of the will among the electorate to come in and say, look, I'm only going to do this for a couple years, but while I'm here, let me kind of clean things up locally.
It's a hard thing to get voters to approve. Yeah. There are a lot of cities where that kind of reform makes sense. It's an ongoing debate in the city of Sacramento, and virtually every time, even if the mayor is a popular one, they vote down reforms like this to change the governance system.
Okay, well, let's move on to the issue of the economy, which I know everyone has been enjoying recently. If it's true that in politics it's the economy is stupid, then it has been a very bad couple of weeks for Republicans. The stock market isn't the only measure of the economy, but it is an interesting and significant a measure of activity and health and attitudes about the economy. And the stock market has been heading south, as you all know. I don't need to tell you that. Tim, we were talking back about, I guess, one of the issues that's driving some of the volatility, and that is the tariffs. Talk a bit, or share some of what you were talking about in back about the cost of the tariffs, or this as a tactic that is being used by the White House.
Right. So the White House and President Trump, of course, they love tariffs and love it as a negotiating ploy, as they say. And they make the argument that we're being ripped off around the world, and, other countries have these high tariffs that are a barrier to U.S. goods entering their marketplaces. So we're going to use these tariffs to kind of settle the score. And that's what you've seen with the plan with China and Canada and Mexico. Then there's the bigger plan that's coming on April 2nd. Interestingly, they said, but because we can't put them in place on April Fool's Day, that are reciprocal tariffs. And basically the simple point of that is, well, if you put X tariff on us, we're going to put X tariff on you. Now, they're sold as that's the leverage we need to get low tariffs. But we do a lot of work in the tariff sphere, and our economist Wayne Weingarten just put out a brief on this. And if the issue, right, is we want to lower costs, we want to bring more manufacturing and investment to America, tariffs are the exact wrong thing to do. Prime Minister Trudeau had this great kind of riff when he was talking about what tariffs will mean when they were first proposed a few weeks ago. And it really is true that, prices, we're the ones who pay for tariffs. We're going to pay higher prices for goods. There's going to be fewer job opportunities. There's going to be less investment in the United States. And you might see, we're used to, you got avocados year round and oranges year round, right? Because you have global free trade. Are you going to see a scenario now where, like back in the 1920s, you're not going to have oranges this time of year because it's not orange season anymore? The other thing that I think is an interesting one that isn't really talked about is the Trump administration and President Trump specifically are promoting, hey, U.S. farmers, you can just sell more in the United States now, get ready. Or, hey, Detroit, get ready to make all these cars. Car companies, bring your factories, get them running, and bring all the car making back to the United States. Well, it's not that easy. Now, for farmers, I had a chat with our ag fellow, Pam Lewison, who's a farmer in Washington State, and she said, for her, it's the certainty. It's the one day of this tariff, then it's off, then it's a different amount. But the bigger thing is growers are growing for the global marketplace. So you might have all these soybeans, for example, and she said, I can't sell those anywhere else. They're not going to sell in the United States in the amount that we have built them. It's predicated on the demand of the global marketplace. And then when you look at factories and building, right, you don't just snap your fingers and have a factory up and running, because it means, right, you've got to build the factory, got to have the infrastructure in place, you got to have the transportation infrastructure in place, you got to have the buyer, you got to have the workforce. And on things like pharmaceuticals, right, that may be 10 years, because the factors of production for pharmaceuticals are in China and India. And there's a lot involved in building factories, manufacturing facilities for pharmaceuticals. So it's going to be a hugely disruptive, potentially. The bigger one, too, also is parts. My colleague right now, he had an issue. His head gasket broke on his car. Now, independent of the tariffs, right, it told him 2 months before he could get the part. You're going to have this a lot, that you're not going to be able to get the parts for a lot of things, because a lot of parts are made in Canada. So it's going to be hugely disruptive. It's not going to bode well for the ultimate quality of life issue that a president is judged on. Certainly the last president was judged on, right, was what are things costing? What's the cost of living? So there's a lot of things that in the kind of way we debate it, right, is kind of a, slogan way that we're really debating it. But there are huge, serious consequences from if anything like what's talked about is actually implemented, really have negative implications and really affect nearly every American.
I mean, then I think you make a good point on the onshoring piece of this too, right? If the real goal of this is to bring jobs back to the U.S., it seems like there's a few stops between China and America, right? Like I could see a lot of these multinational companies, why not go to Vietnam? Go to Indonesia. It just doesn't seem as simple as, we put this tariff on China and all of a sudden we bring manufacturing back home. You add on top of that kind of the political uncertainty. Yes, Trump is, some in his administration have voiced this. No, this is a drug war until April 2nd, and then it's a trade war. But Trump is not thinking that way. I mean, he even made comments in the Oval Office talking about needing to bring auto jobs back home with these tariffs that he's putting on Mexico. Not to mention the Canada fentanyl connection, which has always seemed loose, to be generous. I think that politically, this is a huge question mark for me. I really don't have a good sense of how this is going to land with voters. I've seen some polling, Navigator put out some polling that really among voters who strongly supported Trump, they're for the tariffs, strongly opposed Trump, they're not. But for Trump voters who had reservations or who self-described as having reservations about Trump, there's some weakness, but still like almost 4 in 10 couldn't make up their mind on kind of how they felt about the tariffs yet, which makes sense because this has been kind of a fluctuating situation from day to day. I think the challenge for Democrats is they agree on the problem, right? Joe Biden spent, years clamoring for more investments and bringing manufacturing back home. He did it a different way by, printing money and handing it out to chip manufacturers, but the problem was still the same. So I think Democrats run a risk of criticizing the tariffs too hard because they agree that on the problem of onshoring manufacturing. I think their best bet is probably tying this to this larger picture of where the money is going, right? For as much as we can talk about bringing jobs back or punishing other countries or using it as a cudgel in immigration, a big piece of this is also revenue generation, right? Mm-hmm. Trump is looking under every seat cushion he can to find revenue to pay for these tax cuts, whether that's tariffs and whether that's cuts to programs like Medicaid. So I think if Democrats paint a larger narrative that all of these costs are being taken out of your pocket to fund these tax cuts, that might be more effective than trying to fight this day-to-day tariff fight when kind of day-to-day we don't know what's coming around the corner.
The revenue point's a great one, and that's one that is championed all the time, right? I mean, there's been, right, the discussion of we're going to create a Department of External Revenue because we're going to be generating so much revenue.
And then fire their agents.
And then fire their agents, yes. We're not going to generate any revenue from this. And it's Americans that pay it, or it's the importer, right, that pays it. One thing, too, on car production, right? Cars go across the border like 14 or 15 times when they are in the factory production. So one thing that's unclear, right, is if we continue to have, kind of U.S., Canada, Mexico car manufacturing, we're going to have tariffs imposed 14 times? That's interesting to me. I think the other thing that kind of gets lost in the equation is when there's the discussion of kind of unfair trade practices with Canada and Mexico. Well, who negotiated the deal
That's right.
back in the day? Yeah. This is USMCA. This isn't NAFTA. So I think there's also, on the point of the politics, you saw the other day, it's this kind of weird dynamic you had in the campaign, right, where a lot of labor leaders actually supported President Trump, and labor leaders in kind of the trades and UAW. The Teamsters Union president, who was kind of, here and there in the last election, came out all in for what Trump is trying to do. So if Trump, succeeds, could this add to that kind of, what you could argue realignment that we saw in the last election?
I was thinking about back in the late 1980s. Remember, was it 1987? There was the stock market correction, and the Reagan administration's kind of top economic officials came out and said, "Don't worry, this is the underlying economy is solid. This is not a problem." Wall Street basically agreed, and the economy was basically solid. Trump hasn't been able to do that. He seems to freak out Wall Street, like he did Sunday with his interview with Maria Bartiromo on Fox News, where he didn't say we were going to have a recession, but he didn't come out and say, there's no way we're going to have a recession in the greatest economy in the world. He basically said, I don't want to talk about a recession, but, stuff happens.
Yeah. But there's only so much I think politicians can do to kind of overcome feelings. I think back to McCain's comments in 2008 where he said, no, the fundamentals of the economy are strong, and people are just like, I'm living in a different reality. And you could apply that to Biden too. First, it's hard to explain away, what people are feeling.
And Biden certainly had the problem of both not well communicating the impacts of his thing, as well as not having, and this is really the point of my bringing this up, not having the government officials who would go out there and fight those battles for him. And I was Tim, you're a political communications specialist. What would you suggest for this administration? Because part of their message is if you've been following them, is like, okay, look, there's going to be disruption, there's going to be pain, but we're making these big changes that we think are going to bring more money and jobs to the United States. You can agree or disagree with that, but that's basically what they're saying. What would you suggest they sell it as? Because
I'd start with a conference call just to get on the same page of, is this a trade war? Is this a fentanyl war? But I don't know.
Yeah.
And the fentanyl thing, they're calling it fentanyl because legally he can evoke the powers if it's a fentanyl issue.
Oh, really?
So if there are different procedures at play if it's, an unfair trade dispute. Those are all kind of baked into trade agreements. I think good communication stems from good policy. So, I think the biggest thing they should do is really look in the mirror and say, you know what you were elected on: improve the economy, lower the cost of living, bring more jobs and investment back to the United States. Objectively, not just our own research, but many other people's research, this kind of global trade war and all these tariffs are not going to do any of those things. So it's kind of one of those, you feel for them, but I don't think there's any, as has been said in politics before, you cannot put lipstick on a pig. And if you have bad policy, you're going to be bailing water the whole time.
Okay. Well, on another aspect of economic issues, let's talk about the federal budget and the shutdown fight. Today, the House managed to actually pass a continuing resolution. It's a 6-month continuing resolution that includes a slight increase in defense and about, $13 billion in cuts to domestic spending. Not exactly a thing to do if what you're trying to do is reach Democratic voters. They didn't need Democratic House votes. They didn't need them in the House, but they are going to need it in the Senate. And their deadline, I guess, before shutdown is Friday. Tim, let's start with you again. This has been described as this Speaker Mike Johnson basically trying to jam this down the throat of the Senate, saying, yep, we've passed this. The House is leaving town, so you, the Senate, have to pass this, or you're the ones who shut down. And of course, by you, he means the 8 Democrats who are supposed to, cross party lines to get this across, because there's a 60-seat threshold for this. So, pig with lipstick or good policy? Good strategy? It's a hardball strategy, but will it work?
Right. Well, I've been in the middle of that often when I worked in the legislature, because the Senate would always pass a terrible budget and then adjourn for the summer, and then we in the Assembly would be debating the budget in the middle of July and the middle of August. So it can be an effective strategy because people want to go home. I would say on this one, and it kind of goes into the larger issues of kind of where are the Democrats now? Where do they want to position themselves? What do they want to do? So whenever you do anything in politics, my former boss, Connie Conway, who was a Republican leader in the Assembly and later a member of Congress, she had many brilliant things that she taught me. But one thing that was most important is in anything you do, you need to ask yourself this question: how does it help us win? And so when you're looking at this, that's largely kind of a procedural vote. It's in many ways a kind of Biden light. You know, it's largely the existing spending priorities continued for the next 6 months. Is stopping this the hill to die on? Are you going to get any better for your cause? Are you going to rally the troops? Are you going to move the ball forward if you stop this? Is this the fight you want to fight? Or do you want to, let's get to September and let's build our case and let's get our plan and let's, marshal the grassroots and make the debate and the fight what's going to happen in September? And I would argue that's what they should do, is focus on that. Now, it is Congress, so they might, decide, no, we're going to kill this bill. And I believe you need 60 votes for this bill in the Senate. And Democrats in the Senate sound pretty lukewarm in what they've said up to this point. So we will see. But I think it's part of the bigger question, right? Is where are Democrats going as a party? What's the road to the comeback? And if you stop this now, think of the optics. You're the ones as Democrats who shut down the government. Republicans voted to keep the government open. So you're going to be the bad guy. And you don't really have an alternative that you're offering other than we're mad, and we're still mad. So I would argue for them, it'd be better. This is largely a kick the can down the road kind of a bill. Do that and really get serious about regrouping and figure out, where do you want to go? Where are you at? What's our fight going to be going forward? Even the basic things, communicating what are the budget values we're fighting for? Because right now all you see is a lot of, cane shaking and anger.
Auction signs.
But you're not seeing, here's what we would do if we were in the majority, and this is why we should be given the keys to Congress in the next election.
Yeah, I think you can make the strongest argument that the hill Democrats should die on is Medicaid. I think especially when you look at, take California, for example. Republicans made a lot of gains in California this past cycle. If you look on the map of where those gains were made, it's in inland areas, Central Valley, Inland Empire, Imperial County, Riverside County, places with high Medicaid populations. I'll take David Valadeo's district, for example. He represents the area just north of Bakersfield. Biggest pro-Trump shift of any district in California between 2020 and 2024. Mm-hmm. Also, the highest share of Medicaid residents of any district in California. You have 2/3 of people in his district on Medicaid. Also one of the highest food stamp CalFresh populations. So if you're David Valadeo right now, that is a really vexing challenge when you're talking about what the speaker is telling you to do and what your actual residents and the effects on them from that kind of vote. Same thing with, Riverside, Imperial County. So I think those are places, at least here in California, where Democrats really can stand to gain, to quote James Carville, by rolling over and playing dead. If Republicans are going to go ahead with those kind of cuts and they say, we need $880 billion just out of the committee that oversees Medicaid, you're not getting 880 by firing park rangers, right? It's going to come down to these real service cuts. And I think you can make an argument that's the strongest position that the Hill Democrats should ultimately die on.
And if you're going to have that debate, which that's a debate worth having, because there are a lot of issues for government-run healthcare programs and the subsidies and whether they're sustainable. And also, just because you make a cut doesn't mean you're cutting a service that's being delivered. And that's kind of the big fight, that overarches all of these.
Department of Education, for example, right?
Right, is can we deliver these more efficiently? Should we provide these subsidies to states that we have for a long time? So, but I agree that the the politics of it are challenging. And so if you're going to do it as Republicans, that's why you have Trump very clearly say, we are not going to touch these things. He understands you are playing with political fire on those things. I would argue on the policy, it's long overdue that this kind of conversation about healthcare reform, what can we afford, what's fiscally responsible, how can we be more efficient, they are unsustainable going forward. American people don't have the stomach for the kind of tax burden you would have to pay for them and continue to pay for them. So it adds to the gravity of the decisions they have to make in September. Add to it the debt ceiling and all these other issues, right? This September vote, we always say it, right? But it could be one of the most hugely consequential in recent memory.
And that would also give the Democratic Party time to catch its breath, regroup, and build the momentum, as well as feeding off whatever is happening in the White House between now and then. One thought I had, and I mentioned in the back room, was I think there's an argument that we'll probably see from some Democrats when they start to realize where all this issues about, whether it's the education department or other government, federal government redistribution of monies, states pay in and then the government pays back. A lot of blue states will actually come off better because a lot of blue states are net payers, right, to the federal government, with probably the exception on the red side of Florida and Texas. Most red states are net recipients. So when we talk about, like San Francisco possibly losing $3 million in federal education funding, I mean, the argument used to be made by folks in the center right. It's like, well, why should, say, San Francisco be paying $4 million to Washington, D.C.? Part of the money then gets spent on administrators there. Other parts of it go to other states. And then that $3 million comes back to San Francisco. Just a suggestion. I think you'll.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think especially in the education space, where you're talking about a lot of the decisions on like what governs education are not coming from the federal government. It's happening locally, and in fact, a lot of the funding that's coming to California schools is happening locally. I do think on something like healthcare, though, there would be massive effects because of the Medicaid expansion. California was one of those states that opted into this expanded Medicaid under Obamacare. So if that goes away, or if that is changed, or the federal government is no longer giving, I think it's 80-90%. That's a massive hole in the state budget that cannot be just filled overnight or by shifting money around. And so I think you're going to see especially pain in those states, rural hospitals. I think that's the kind of service delivery that lacking the federal investment that we've seen could just dramatically shift.
And I think that's right. And that's why if you're going to go down that path, that's a debate worth having. There are just the point about the state budgets, right? It's a huge portion of various state budgets. There's been a lot of controversy, right? There's always controversy, right, over should you take the federal money because they come with strings attached. And so there are still red states having these debates over should we opt into the exchanges and expand. Again, for sustainability, you could argue we shouldn't have done that in the first place. This is a debate we've been having since that time, and if you do it right, is the fight that you could put these programs on a sustainable path going forward. Guy's right, too, on when we talk about Department of Education and some of these other things. You've seen all the kind of protests in Washington, right, in front of the buildings, and that infamous rally with Maxine Waters and Charles Schumer. And when we talk about 80-20 issues, people see what's going on in Washington. They see you're back there fighting for federal workers in the Washington area. They're not communicating, well, what value do we get from these workers? A lot of these workers, up until very recently, they didn't go in the office at all, not even one day a week. So that is not the hill I would die on there. You need to communicate what is the value that you're getting for this. And so when you talk about the Department of Education, Sure, you could lay off a lot of bureaucrats, which today they announced they're going to, but a lot of the Department of Education really it's a grant department. And you could easily restructure the federal government that a lot of these grant programs are administered out of other departments.
That is such a good point about kind of the strategy Democrats need to approach on that. I remember I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Jerry Brown. We did this whole oral history project about his career, and he talked about this trip that he took to the Department of Education in Washington, and he walked along the cubicles and the rows, and all he saw was kind of row after row of people typing out grants, checking to see if different requirements were felt for funding, and it felt to him a long way from the classroom. You have your teacher, your principal, your school board, your county board of education, the state senate and assembly have education committees. There's a state board of education. There's a state superintendent of public instruction. Now we're all the way up in the Department of Education. It just felt very far away from the classroom. So that emphasis on where standing our, Democrats standing ground and fighting on actual service delivery versus bureaucracy, I think is going to be really important for the party. And whether that's healthcare or other programs where they can point to and say, you're going to lose this service in your life versus this job that you probably don't really realize on a day-to-day basis is going away.
So there has been a lot of criticism of the Democratic Party from a number of folks in the Democratic coalition saying, hey, you leaders are not doing enough to fight back, whether it's you in Congress or you governors or whatever. Nancy Pelosi, I guess, said that we've got a plan. Does anyone know what that plan is?
Actually, I think there's kind of two different conversations here. One is like taking back the House in 2 years. That I actually see the rollover, play dead, whatever the comments are. Like, we're talking about 3 seats.
Yeah.
You mentioned, the historic trends of, the president in power, their party, losing power in a midterm election. The fact that like the high propensity, low propensity electorate thing has switched. Now Democrats are the party of high propensity voters. That's another edge for midterms. The fact that there probably will be some kind of painful budget cuts in some way or another, that those challengers can go back to their districts and say, look, this Congress member cut this or tried to cut this in the same way they did for Obamacare. 3 seats in that context doesn't seem like there needs to be this massive grand plan or this unified vision. I think that conversation does need to happen for Democrats before the next presidential election, regaining some semblance of a party identity or refinding their footing among the working class voters that have really been the base of the party for so many years. That needs to happen, but I don't think that needs to happen to have a successful midterm, if that makes sense.
I would say, I think the road for the Democrats is more complicated than you think. Because if you look at, all these kind of things we're talking about today, and, you could call them controversies, what are those controversies that are getting beyond the kind of, the political circles and the beltway bubbles? If you look at, the State of the Union speech last week, and you go through and they asked the viewers, and, some polls asked viewers, some polls asked, voters at large. When you look at what do you think of DOGE and the kind of effort of cutting bureaucracy, it's close to an 80-20 issue. Musk himself may be being made into kind of a political football and caricature, but the idea of cutting bureaucracy and the part of his speech where he went through, here's all the things, they were largely USAID kind of things, the average person looks at that and say, yeah, we should cut all that stuff. Right? When you go through on the immigration front and kind of what they've been talking about, that's largely an 80-20 issue. And so when you go through kind of the issues that have been the highlight for Trump in the first 6 or 8 weeks of the administration, they're largely pretty popular issues. So, yes, there's warning ahead with how do you get the budget? Do you get a budget? Because that's going to be all this issue of reconciliation. It's a huge challenge that you're going to bring everybody together with a no vote margin, and there's a lot of landmines out there to navigate through. But I think it's not I wouldn't go into it as it's a fait accompli or that the 6-year itch that's a normal thing would apply. I think it's going to be a tough battle for them because Trump is still setting the issues and setting the agenda. And on the things that he's, been focusing on, if you look at the polls, they're pretty overwhelmingly popular.
And I'll throw another challenge for Democrats too for the midterms is that there's not a whole lot of fat left in the House, right? You look at the 2018 midterms, there was a whole suite of Republicans who were representing districts that voted pretty strongly against Trump. Those seats are all now held by Democrats pretty much. You have very few spots where Democrats can point to and say, this is a Republican representing a district we can clearly win, or that Harris clearly won. So there is less margin on that. I also take your point too about, I think Trump probably learned from his first term.
Yeah.
Let's hold off on going to Congress.
Yes.
Because I really do think when you go back to 2017, Republicans never recover from trying to overturn Obamacare. Right after that, they were finished in the 2018 midterms for the House. I think Trump probably looks at that now and says, let me try to stretch out for as long as I can these kind of executive actions where he can control the agenda, to your point, and not turn things over to the House where things get messy, people come up for tough votes, and ultimately you might end up with a result that you don't like.
And these issues we're having, right, these controversies and all the kind of chaos in the executive action, right, these are what you call process issues. We're fighting over, does the law let you do this or that? They're going to be litigated in court. You're not going to lose from the I tried to do a popular thing. Some of those things he may be found to have gone beyond the power given to him by Congress. Some of those things the court's going to rule in his favor. But the controversy is largely, it's a Rob Bonta suing him on everything, right?
And we're folks gathered here in this room because we do follow all kinds of political news and political newsletters and
I thought you were going to say file lawsuits.
Yeah, no.
But the average person in this country does not. They will catch maybe the presidential speech. If things go really, really well, yay. If things go badly, they may not make the connections anyway. I think raging inflation will probably have an impact, and job losses and no rural hospitals will have impacts, but that'll have to wait. So on that happy note, well, listen, thank you all for coming out. Thank you everyone who's watching and listening online. And thanks to Tim Anaya and Guy Marzorati for a great conversation. Thanks to all of you for listening. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you soon.